Welcome to Janet's Planet, where we're traveling at the speed of thought. And today I'm delighted to have my good friend and one of my class's favorites, Artemis Westenberg, back to share with us about women in space. Artemis is President Emerita of Explore Mars and CEO of Explore Mars Europe. Artemis, take us away and inspire us again.
Okay, well, today we're going to talk about women in space. How many are there? Are they really part of it? How did we get there? Did women are part of it from the start? And if not, why not? How much was happening? So, it's an interesting thing to think about. But the ladies you're looking at are the ones that were still alive and were able to come to the launch of the, oh gosh, help me here, Janet, was this the
This was Eileen Collins, who was the first pilot of the space shuttle, and they came down. Yeah.
Yeah, I know it was Eileen Collins, but I don't know which shuttle it was. I don't know whether it's the Atlantis or the Endeavour.
I want
just
to
don't
say
know.
it was Atlantis, but let me check and see.
Yeah, I think it was the Atlantis too. Anyway, these ladies were her personal invitation, and they were there because if you're an astronaut, you're going into the up to space. You can say, of course, these friends or these relatives, I want to be witnessing what I'm going to do, witnessing my my departure, like, you're going to a train station and you're all going to wave. Well, something like this. So she invited these ladies, and NASA then realized, who these ladies were, because these were the ladies that were, and I'm going to talk about that a bit more later on, about who were tested, who were just as able as the Mercury 7. And, it happens to be 7 ladies here too, but, the ladies were 13 of them, and the men were 7 that were selected. Anyway, these ladies were just as capable. They were amazing pilots. They were, they were healthy. They were tested with the same tests as were done with the gentlemen. But Dwight Eisenhower and some others decided that they didn't like it. The whole idea, you needed to be an astronaut only if you were a fighter pilot. Now, these women, like I said, they were pilots, and they actually flew fighter jets. They flew them when they were, built from the factory to where they were needed, whether that was the Navy or the Air Force, didn't matter. They flew them there. And they tested them also, for the factories. Now, you build a plane, you're going to, do it for several test runs before you hand it over. And that's what they did. And it was all amazing. They were absolutely amazing, but they were not actually fighting in the Second World War because they wouldn't allow that. So, so these ladies were out. Well, like I said, NASA realized who these ladies were, not just, some old ladies, I don't know, her ounce or something. I have no idea what NASA thought at first that they were. And they realized, these are, 7 ladies of the original Mercury 13. And so they gave the ladies VIP treatment from there on, which is absolutely what they should have done, years and years before, not just when let me see, how do I get into the next one? Okay. So, we're talking space. Who is doing space at that particular moment in time? Well, 2 countries, Russia and USA, and they were actually fighting. I would almost say like little boys or girls, and, they were fighting who is best, who is, strongest, who is smartest type of thing. It wasn't really a good, it wasn't very uplifting if I look back at that time. But, it got us into space. That's true, because where were they proving that they were the best? They were proving that by trying to get humans into space, and even humans all the way to the moon. Now, you had some moonwalkers, of course. We all know there have been guys on the moon. That's the thing, there have been guys on the moon. These 12 guys walked on the moon. Wonderful, of course. But, no ladies whatsoever. Kind of strange. Because, how were these guys selected? Well, that all started not with the Apollo astronauts, but with the group before them. And that were the Mercury 7 astronauts. 7 astronauts that were selected after, some rigorous testing, quite a bit of rigorous testing, actually. And these were all fighter pilots. And I must tell you that I will show you many women later on, even, the Chinese astronauts, the female astronauts, they are all fighter pilots as well. So this whole idea that we've been, veering off from in America or in Europe, in Japan, that, you don't need to be a fighter pilot, you might be a scientist or very, medical scientist or a biologist or some other science. No, in this time, you are still, a fighter pilot. And like I said, China still is selecting astronauts only from fighter pilots. Anyway, so these were the 7 men. Now, of course, the audience loved this idea. All the general American public was very much in love with this idea of these guys. These look healthy, they are, vigorous. And of course, they were kind of heroes being fighter pilots. And now they're going into space. Wonderful. Yeah, but to sell it to space, actually, they used women, their own women. Now, who were the Mercury 13? It were these women. And they're actually only 12 because I cut off one of them. There was another one. I think that was Jerry Cobb. I'm not sure.
Jerry Cobb, yes. And
I cut off Jerry Cobb because this is and these were 2 pages from a Time magazine. And if I put both of them on, the whole page on, I couldn't have said their names. And then actually it wouldn't really have fit in my slide because all the writing would have even been smaller than this. But these were the ladies, that Randy Lovelace, the guy that was responsible for selecting the male Mercury astronauts, he had this idea, why not, test some female pilots and see how well they do in these tests that we put these Mercury 7 guys through. And, they were actually doing better than the men. And, they were, like I said, they were very dedicated pilots. They were in good health. There were far more pilots than just these 13. I mean, these were the 13 that Dr. Lovelace invited, but he could have, picked more because there were many. In the Second World War and right after it, quite a number of women flew and had lots of experience. But like I said, they weren't in the Navy or in the Air Force as fighter pilots because that wasn't allowed. Not because they weren't capable, just because it wasn't allowed. Like in the Netherlands, until very recently, no woman could be a firefighter. Only very recently, that was one of the professions, from one of the last 2 professions that I finally could have applied for. I'm too old to do that, and I'm not really sure that I would be capable as being a firefighter. But for most of my life, I would have been, it would have been impossible to apply. The same is, do you actually know that I'm too short to be a policeman in the Netherlands? I'm not that short, but in the Netherlands, if you're less than 1 meter and 63 centimeters, you cannot be a policeman because they believe that you will not have the authority to, be a policeman if you're short. Really? Okay. So these are all these real strange ideas, and the same with these pilots, with these women. They had ideas that this is the way it's supposed to be. Like I said, there were many more women who were, using airplanes, were flying them. This is just one of the examples. Here's another one. This was a whole group of WASP pilots, of women pilots that would be helping. And she was actually flying bomber planes because a B stands for a bomber plane, a B-26, a B-29. Those are not, toy planes. These were the planes that they were using to fight the Second World War with. And like I said, the only thing these women were allowed to do was testing them once they were completed in the factory, and then, bring them over to the male pilots, the male fighters in the Army, in the Navy, in the Air Force that would use them. And the 2 ladies are just...
All right, we're experiencing yeah, your screen froze for just a second, but you're back, it looks like.
Okay. Okay. Now, like I said, fighter pilots. You needed to be a fighter pilot or you couldn't be an astronaut. It's a good thing that they lost that idea a long time before the first fighter pilot in the US Air Force, was appointed, before female Air Force fighter pilot, because that was only in 1993. Jeannie Mary Leavitt was the first one to be a fighter pilot, and she actually also became the commander of her squadron. She was a good fighter pilot, but like I said, if we had waited until women fighter pilots would be there would have been no female American astronauts for even longer than they were allowed finally. Next, like I said, we had these Mercury 7 gentlemen, and these Mercury 7 gentlemen, these astronauts, they were married. And to make them more attractive, the males, more attractive to the audience at large, so to the American public, they actually did a number of public relations magazine and newspaper articles about their wives. And one of the reasons that John Glenn and others didn't want the the females that had been selected by Dr. Lovelace to be a pilot, to be an astronaut, like John Glenn and the others, is because they felt that there was a fair chance that the public would love the female astronauts more and would give them, more applause, more fan mail and all these other things. So, would be, bigger and more famous than the man. And so John Glenn actually stopped it. It's one of the things he did when there was a hearing in Congress. He said something really nasty, I would say, about women, that they weren't, capable of doing this, that they should be mothers and they should be, cooking and doing household chores, but not being pilots because they weren't really fit for that. Which of course
it's like, yeah, his whole thing was like, men go off to war, men fly planes. That is not for women to do. So it's like, and Jerry Cobb was very, I mean, she wanted so badly and was very well equipped and very well qualified to be an astronaut. But based on his testimony and others by NASA men, that's when they said no women quite yet. And Russia, as Artemis is going to tell you, beat us by a long shot.
Oh yes, space then. Because this, like I said, this was, this fight, this contest between America and Russia, showing who is best and who is, technologically more, better, which is great. But this was the result. And the guys, I think these three guys in suits are the ones that didn't really go to the moon. They just, they went all the way there. But, the Apollo 13, as we all know, ran into some big problems. And then they told Houston, we have had a problem. I always think that's very funny because the problem was still existing when they were giving this notice to Houston about it. So anyway, that's what they said. And so these are the Apollo astronauts. And, like I said, all men. Now, many, many years later, when we were celebrating 50 years on the moon, oh, I slipped, then you still had these guys, these 8 guys, and the one in this really spunky suit in gray and with these amazing socks. That's Buzz Aldrin, who has a quirky sense of humor, and I like it because all the rest are in, very official, really nice smokings. But his smoking was a bit different. And this is, Apollo 11 moonwalk and the moon landing 50 years later, celebrating it. And these are the astronauts that were still alive and were capable and willing to come together and, celebrate it with the government and, have their picture taken. Now, if you look at, where we stand, like I said, these women are at the moment selected to be walking on the moon. if the Artemis program gets enough funding to take off. But otherwise, one of them might be the one walking on Mars, although that's about 13 years from now. So, they might by that time be too old, because those are the rules. If you're an astronaut, male or female, you have to be very fit and, very strict age limits. So they might be too old by then, but there will be other women, because nowadays we do select women. It's no longer like then. This is the first female astronaut. Actually, she was a cosmonaut. Why do we say cosmonaut? It means you are an astronaut from from Russia, or the Russian Federation. And Roscosmos is the name that we use for the Russian agency. The thing is, what always surprises me as a European, if I see it written in English, it's with a C written, which is silly, because it's definitely not a C in the Russian language, it's a K. And we do have a K in English, so why you change that, I have no idea. But anyway, so it's Roscosmos, this woman, Valentina Tereshkova. Now, only 9 days ago, we could celebrate Yuri's Night. I have no idea whether any of you know what that is. Do you know what it is, Yuri's Night? What do we celebrate? Yuri's Night. Anyone? Raise
Anybody
your
out
hand.
there? Anybody?
No?
Oh, Lucas, you know? What is Yuri's Night?
Yeah.
All right, let me scroll through here. Anybody else know what Yuri's Night is? Okay. I think we've got to tell them, Artemis.
Yeah. So, Lucas, it's and all the others, it's the night we celebrate, an evening with a party on the 12th of April, because Yuri Gagarin, that's the Yuri in Yuri's Night, Yuri Gagarin, was launched into space, and he did some circles into space and then, got back again. And he was the first man to get into space. And then, like I said, it was this contest between Russia and America. So when America didn't select any females, the Russians thought, hey, we can do better. And so they selected a female. And this woman, this Valentina Tereshkova, she went into space on the 16th of June, 1963. And actually, as there is a Yuri's Night, I myself, with many females working in space industry and space agencies, celebrate on the 16th of June with a lunch and a speaker, her launch into space. Now, why was she selected in Russia? She was a fighter pilot? No, she wasn't. The only thing she needed to be able to do was to use a parachute. Because actually the landing of the spacecraft wasn't with the cosmonaut in it. Neither Yuri Gagarin nor Valentina Tereshkova, landed on Earth. They actually jumped from the spacecraft before it landed, and so she needed to be able to be a parachutist, and she was, because that was kind of her hobby. She never, when she started it, I don't think she was thinking, oh, I want to be an astronaut. She just thought, jumping out of a plane with a parachute was really cool. And it was a cool feeling of gliding in through the sky until you land again. That's why she did it. And because she was actually a factory worker, she wasn't a scientist. Like I said, she wasn't a pilot. She was just a Russian young woman with a hobby. And this hobby got her into space. So she went into space for 3 days, June 16 launch. She came back on June 19, 1963. And, this was, a public relations stunt, actually, more by Russia. That was all it was. Now, only a few months later, she married an astronaut or a cosmonaut, of course is the right word, Mr. Nikolaev. Because this whole idea that this woman, could be an astronaut, could go into space, even in Russia, wasn't really the way they thought about it. They felt that she should be a mother and, a wife. So they kind of married her off to this guy. And so she had 2 kids with him, and she never went into space again. And that was it for her. Now, there was another female cosmonaut not much longer after that, um, that was Svetlana Savitskaya. I said not long after that, look at it, 1963, 1982, which tells you it really was a public relations stunt. It had nothing to do with believing that females were equal to men and could be, doing the same things as men, because believe me, there were a lot of male cosmonauts in between 1961, Yuri Gagarin, and this year that finally a female, another and the second female from Russia, was sent into space. So, this is just how it is. And now, was it much better on the American side? I showed you all these guys that went to the moon. And of course, after that, we did Skylab. We did a lot of other stuff. It wasn't that we didn't do anything anymore after the last moon landing in 72, but no females, still no females. And then finally in 1983, so even a year after the second lady from Russia, almost a year, Sally Ride, the first female American astronaut, went into the Skylab, the very first one. So finally, women get a foot in the game. Well, there were still a lot of ideas of what a woman should really be like. And, let alone, all these people that went into space, males as well, all the men, they had my skin color. No brown, no darker than brown, nothing, just white people. And so there were some African American male astronauts, and I think Charles Bolden was one of, if not the first, one of the first. He later became the boss of NASA. And then finally, in 1992, on the 12th of September, Mae Jemison became the first female African American astronaut. Before that, if there were females, they were all white. That's just the way it was. I told you I'd bias, 2 weeks ago. Well, this was, of course, all bias, because believe me, people of any color did go to very interesting schools. They had good education. And it wasn't like they weren't able, just like the females were just as able as the males, male Americans. No, they weren't selected. Now, she was selected. I met her 2 years ago. Very nice lady. Interesting, still very much involved with STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math outreach for younger children like you. And, who was really leading everything? Now, you must have heard about Johnson Space Center. I do believe you did. You all know what that is. That's where the astronauts train. There's a big, big water tank. It's so big that they placed the International Space Station inside it, parts of it, and then the astronauts underwater in, of course, not in a spacesuit. Are they in a spacesuit? Yeah, they might be in their spacesuit. In their spacesuits, they train what it's like to do all the things they have to do at the International Space Station while underwater, because that's the best way of mimicking what it feels like when you're, weightless in space. Now, in 1994, finally, the first female became director of this very important NASA facility. Because if this is the place where people are trained and tested and selected, then you understand that having a female as a director might make a difference in how you look at stuff. Not completely, but she might bring her own ideas, her own background into it. And that's probably a bit different than all the males. So, it was kind of like looking up. We had a female astronaut now into space. We've had, even of color. It was kind of looking like, oh, we're getting there. And finally, because we were talking Russia and the USA, right? And of course, the European Space Agency, ESA, had its own astronauts. But you guessed it, all males, until the year 1996. This female, Claudie Henriet, went into space. She went to the Mir, that's the Russian space station, which either means world or peace, that word in Russian. And she was the first female astronaut. And she only was astronaut for a few years. In 1999, she decided no longer to be an astronaut. She became a member of the French government. She was a French astronaut. And so again, Europe had no female astronauts, only males, quite a number, until this lady came aboard. She was sent, I think she was selected in 2012. She was sent after a lot of training, of course, to the International Space Station on the 23rd of November, 2014. And she actually is a fighter pilot, but she's also a scientist. She studied many languages. She's very multilingual, a polyglot, as we say. And she also studied a lot of science. And so, being a fighter pilot and a scientist, of course, made her a very good candidate. So she became the second female astronaut. You do realize 1996, then 1999, Claudia Angéré said, no, I no longer want to be an astronaut. Then it takes 15 years before the next female astronaut from Europe is getting into space. That's not really helping a lot, is it? It's not really going fast, which is really a pity because, of course, by 2014, that's not so long ago. I would say you all know that by now girls and boys get the same education. So there's no real reason why females shouldn't fly just like males.
Hey, Artemis, you got a question from Lucas. I saw your hand, sweetheart. It's been there for a while. What was your question, sweetie?
I've heard about Samantha Chris Betty before, or whatever it is, her last name is, since she flew with Terry Volts on the International Space Station.
Oh, because you love Terry Volts. It's like I'd have to see if we could get him on and everything. But thank you. I just wanted to see what your question was, baby. All right, okay. Back to you, Artemis.
Okay, so so I told you, in '93, someone became director of Johnson Space Center, and how very important that is. Now, of course, there is also NASA's boss, which is called the administrator. And we still don't have had a female boss of NASA, but at least in 2005, we finally got a secondary boss, the deputy administrator of NASA, Shana Dana. So it's getting there, and there have been more females. There have been 2, at least, that I know after this. Laurie Garver has been deputy administrator. Deva Newman has been a deputy administrator very recently. So, it's finally we're getting there. And also, there are more and more females being selected. Now, I've been talking about astronauts that were working for the government. It was either Russia, it was America, could have been a European country, it could also be Canada, or it could be Japan. Those were all countries that, selected astronauts and sent them up. And somewhere in between, there was this idea that people who were really, really, really wealthy, because we're talking $20 million, $25 million or more, would be allowed to go to the International Space Station. Well, if I say allowed, then I'm not talking about the American ideas about it. NASA didn't want, civilians, even if they were trained, to go to the space station. But when the Soviet Union no longer was a federation, and they were really in need of money in their space program, and so they started to sell what you could say, tickets. It was places on their Soyuz to get to the space station to very wealthy people. And they would select them also. It wasn't just you show up and you're wealthy and okay, you can fly. You would have to train. They would make sure that you're really healthy enough. Otherwise, they wouldn't allow you. And Anousheh Ansari, went to the International Space Station on the 18th of 2006, after a few males that were very, very rich had gone there as well. And I think Dennis Tito was the first. And So she went there and she actually trained not just to make sure that she would be healthy enough and would know how to what to do, not to break anything if you're up there. She also trained really to do research, because her idea was she trained for 18 months to do the research, just about the same amount of time as a normal astronaut from either NASA, Russia, or all the other European Space Agency or whatever, who were in the employment of the government to do research on the International Space Station. She, Anusha Ansari, did actually the same amount of training to make sure that when she was at the International Space Station, she wouldn't just be, snapping pictures out of the window or snapping pictures inside. She actually would also work there. And that's what she did. And as far as I know, she found that it was an amazing thing to happen to you. So, lucky her that she could afford it. Now, I said, Russia, USA, Europe. And if I say the European Space Agency, they're actually countries part of that. They're not actually in Europe. Canada. Canada is part of the European Space Agency group, which is kind of silly because we all know Canada is not in Europe. It's above the United States of America. But anyway, so these three groups. And then finally, China built up its own human spaceflight. And they actually did that by buying knowledge and people with the knowledge from the Russian space agency, which has been, going almost bankrupt. And so now we have a fourth big country or big conglomerate that's able to send humans to space. And of course, they selected guys first. I don't have to explain that to you. But in 2009, they started to select females. And the females that were selected were only selected from, again, fighter pilots. And only those could be candidate taikonauts. Now, I told you the word for Russian astronaut is cosmonaut. So this, if you say astronaut, you say you're a traveler to the stars. And if you say you're a cosmonaut, you're a traveler to the cosmos, so to the universe. And a taikonaut is about the same word, a traveler to the tycoon, to the universe. It's what this word is. So fighter pilots, and they selected them. And then, of course, one was going to be the first. That's this lady, Liu Yang. She was the first female taikonaut on the 16th of June, 2012. Remember, 16th of June, 1963, the first female in space. So all these many years later, nearly 50 years later, you have this female astronaut, this Chinese woman. Now you would think, in these nearly 50 years, we have changed a lot. And the idea about what women should be or should not be, what John Glenn said, that, men go off to war and women, they really, should be in the house and should do homework. And I'm not talking homework for school, but I'm talking, cooking and cleaning. Actually, in China, it hadn't changed a lot, because although the male astronauts could be whatever they wanted to be, let me see, these females had to be married and had to have children. They had to be mothers. Otherwise, they would not be selected. That's a very silly way of doing it. Partly that's because they are afraid, they believe that if you're a female and you go into space, because of space radiation, you afterwards might not be able to give birth to healthy babies. So they want the women to have babies before they go into space. That's not completely strange, but as such, still, it's a lot of bias going on. Now, we had all these astronauts and cosmonauts, females, finally. You would think that the first Russian cosmonaut, the first Russian female astronaut to go to the International Space Station would have happened long before this date. But only in 2014, so less than 6 years ago, finally a Russian cosmonaut, female, got to the International Space Station. You do understand that, the people that are going to the International Space Station are for a very large part Russian and Americans, yes, but a lot of Russians. And those were all males for decades, all males. And of course, we're talking the International Space Station. It was only like a decade, but before that, the other Skylab, Mir, all the other space stations we've had, only males. This was the first to go to the International Space Station. Now, there's this other thing. We were supposed to go and have a spacewalk, an all-female spacewalk. And that was supposed to happen before this date of the 19th October 2019. But it didn't happen. You know why? They didn't have a spacesuit in the right size for the other female. The other female was shorter, and there are only a very limited number of spacesuits up there in the International Space Station. And they didn't have another spacesuit fit for a woman. They only had, tall sizes. And she needed a medium. So they had to wait, I think, a year, perhaps less.
It was almost a year.
Yeah, it was almost a year, right? And, because what happens to the International Space Station, we all know, you have these launch of these astronauts and they go to the International Space Station and, they have to eat, of course, and they do these research and everything. Well, almost every month there is a, you could say it's a truck, then a space truck that goes to the International Space Station, and they could be a European model or a Japanese model or an American model, and they are stuffed full of all the stuff that people need on the International Space Station, including spacesuits. And so they went and, did a spacesuit transfer to the International Space Station. So now finally, this all-female spacewalk finally happened in 2019. Christina Koch and Jessica Meir finally were able to walk in space. Now, it's quite interesting to know how many females are there really astronauts, on all the astronauts in total. And if I'm saying astronauts, I mean all of them. Every person that really went into space and traveled into space, not just, flew very high, but really went into space, there are 553 astronauts in total. And that's European astronauts, American astronauts, Russian, Chinese, Japanese, don't care, all of them, male and female. 65, so 553, 65, and that's a little bit over 10% are females. The rest were all males. And these pictures weren't actually, done because of a bias over women. This happened to be, you have, as an astronaut, you have to go to the Johnson Space Center sometimes, and then they want to have your official astronaut picture taken. And, for one reason or the other, perhaps she didn't have someone to babysit this 4-year-old son of her, or perhaps her son just wanted to come and she thought it was a good idea. I don't know. This wasn't planned by NASA, but she brought her son and they did these official pictures, of the astronauts with their helmet under their arm, looking really, very, very serious. And then the person taking the picture said, let's take a few pictures with your son. And of course, her baby boy, the 4-year-old, thought it was great fun. And here is a picture of him kissing his mom. So 65 females. And of course, all of them are much more than just wives and mothers. They're simply scientists, pilots, and all these other, things you need to be to become what you are. Now, if we're talking space astronauts, we always talk government, right? And a few tourists that go up, and that's it. But, who gets us into space? It's not just, the leaders of NASA. It's also the leaders of space industry. And I've just picked her as a picture, but I know that big companies like Aerojet Rocketdyne, Boeing, they had females in the highest level of the board of directors. So it isn't just, you know, the astronauts or just the director of Johnson Space Center that's important. And I think this one is really important. SpaceX, and if I say SpaceX, all of you say Elon Musk, right? Elon Musk, that's SpaceX. Well, yes and no, because this woman, Gwynne Shotwell, has been leading SpaceX since the very beginning. She herself told me she was employee number 7, so the 7th person that, you know, was hired by Elon Musk to be in his company. I noticed that Wikipedia says that she was the 11th employee. I will contact Gwynne and ask, you know, what's what, because then we need to change Wikipedia on this. And she's been making sure that, you know, the rockets fly, that everything, you know, is built, that the company really flourishes. That's her job. Every rocket that goes up, that's her job. Of course, there are a lot of engineers and other people working with her, but she's the boss. She's the one that makes sure that SpaceX flies. So, you know, in that sense, a female has been in charge of a very important part of space flight for a long time. Now, if we're talking SpaceX, we're talking the Dragon. And if you see on the left-hand side, the Dragon cargo, that's one of the trucks, space trucks that go to the International Space Station and bring all this science equipment and food and clothes and, you know, whatever they want, they need there, they bring it. But this capsule was always meant also to bring 7 people maximum. That's the same amount that would fly up with the space shuttle to the International Space Station. So 7 people up to the International Space Station. And they've been testing. They've been, you know, trying to do this, that. They've been testing their big rockets. They've been testing the capsule that does the cargo. So the space truck has been going to the International Space Station for many years now. And next month, on the 27th of May, that's the planning, you know, that might change, of course, if the weather is really bad or something happens. It will be the first crewed mission of SpaceX to the International Space Station. However, 2 men. I have no idea why. Because believe me, there are females capable of doing this. And as far as I know, there are females in the group of people that SpaceX selected and trained to go to the International Space Station with their, you know, with their Dragon capsule on top of the Falcon rocket. So I have no idea. I think it's very, very strange and very bad PR, if I may say something.
You know, I'm so glad you said that, Artemis, because I wondered the same thing. It's like, why not? Because it's like, it's the first time in a very long time that we've launched from US soil rather than Kazakhstan. So I have a big question mark about that as well. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah, and I will personally, you know, ask Gwynne, you know, what's going on with this. So, you know, I've been talking about space agencies, and these are all their, you know, their nice logos. And you have on top, you have Roscosmos, then you have NASA, then you have the European Space Agency. Underneath there is ASI, that's the Italian Space Agency, then JAXA, which is the Japanese Space Agency, DLR, that's the German Space Agency, then Canada Space Agency, then you have China, then you have the Israel Space Agency and the UK Space Agency. And actually there are a couple of more by now, because also the United Arab Emirates has a space agency. So yeah, we are really getting more and more space agency. And Luxembourg has a space agency, and Portugal has a space agency. So it feels like, you know, this is all government, right? This is all government. And, you know, with these few tourists that are really wealthy and then can go into space, if they pay the Russians enough to go there, that's it. Well, not anymore, because things change. My good friend, Dr. Mindy Howard, is slated to fly into space as a commercial astronaut, a female commercial astronaut, actually as a leader of people that are paying for it. She is like the travel leader, your helper. She's training the people also. She's training them how to, physically, but for a very large part, it's mental training that she's doing. And this is really important. Why is it important? If you go to the International Space Station for the government, or even as a space tourist, you'll be there for about 10 days, which means that, you go up. It takes a while to dock at the International Space Station. You get into the space station, and then you have a couple of days there that you either work, but you work and sleep, and you have some spare time, and that's it. So you can really experience being in space. But if you are a commercial astronaut, and if you're just, a commercial, actually also kind of space tourist, and you fly either with space or with Virgin Galactic or with Blue Origin, then you actually won't be for many days in space. You will only be up for, I think, 90 minutes, and only a few minutes of there, I'm not totally sure, but it's like 6 or 10 minutes, something like that. So it's rather short. You will be weightless and being able to look outside from your capsule and see that the fact, proof with your own eyes that Earth is really a globe. You will see, that there's a curvature, as we say. And so if you are not trained mentally to be completely in the moment, you might be so overwhelmed with everything that's happening, the G forces on your body while you're launched, and then suddenly you're weightless, perhaps you're now very nauseous. It's really overwhelming. And unless you're trained to concentrate on what's happening, you might end up landing on Earth without really having experienced the way you wanted it, the full experience of, being an astronaut, being weightless, being in space. So she's training people and she's helping people to make the best of it. So that's one part. Not
and Artemis, when Mindy is actually online with us. Mindy, would you like to say anything? Mindy, do you want to say hi to everybody?
Hi, wait a second. Let me I guess I can start my video. Can you?
Yeah. There we go. This is who Artemis was just speaking of, you guys.
Hi, everyone. Artemis said it perfectly, actually. She explained about the importance of training, and if you're not trained well, you're going to miss your entire experience if it's so quick. And it was actually, it's only 4 minutes of weightlessness.
It's even less.
That you'll get on a Virgin Galactic flight. So yeah,
yeah,
it's crazy, but you explained it perfectly. But hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. And I'll hand the floor back to Artemis. Thank you.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you for being here.
Sure. Love it.
So, so like I said, this is a commercial astronaut. Mindy is a commercial astronaut. She's not trained or picked by the government. And truth be told, in the Netherlands, we're both in the Netherlands, we have a feeling that the European Space Agency and our government, we have a Dutch space office, are not really very happy that she is being hailed as an astronaut, because they go like, we didn't select her. Yes, so what? I mean, this is modern times. I mean, the days that it's all only government are over. The moment SpaceX, has its crewed cabin that goes up, it's not just the United States of America who can pay for that launch. It's, private organizations, private companies, wealthy private people, they can pay and they can go. And the same holds, and that's really going into space, more than 4 minutes. And the other companies that, are aiming for suborbital flights, like Virgin Galactic, like Blue Origin, they actually, they can, again, if you have money, you can go into space. Now, this picture that I'm showing you is the first female German astronaut. Why is that a point? Why is that a thing? Well, Germany was supposed to select an astronaut 2 years ago for the European Space Agency, and then present the selection, and then the European Space Agency could say, no, we are picking a Portuguese astronaut, not the German one, There could have been, but the pre-selection of astronauts should have been from Germany and from other countries. And of course, in Germany, there were females that applied, and they were most certainly qualified, but none of the females were selected. And 2 or 3 males were presented to the European Space Agency. So 2 or 3 German males were presented as candidate astronauts to the European Space Agency, and none of the females. And now the lady, if you can see my cursor, this lady, Claudia Kessler, who is the founder and CEO of a employment agency that selects people to work for a space industry or the European Space Agency. She was very angry, and so she started this project, which is called the Female Astronaut. In German, that's called die Astronautin. And she selected some ladies, and she has them trained. Dr. Susanna Randall and Dr. Inza Thiele-Eich. And these were ladies that had, I think, applied to Germany to be presented to the European Space Agency, and they weren't. And so they are training, and this is a picture actually at Johnson Space Center, where they were visiting and talking about training, because she wants to make sure that there will be a female German astronaut. And she is putting a lot of her own money in this, because like I said, she wants to make sure it's more than this. Now, of course, everything we're doing, everything I am doing, is about this first footstep on Mars. Will that be by a female? I have a secret to tell. Many years ago, when I started in space industry, that's really decades ago, I was still one of the few females. And so a lot of male colleagues, and they would all say to me, if we go to Mars, it will not be like on the moon. A woman will be the first one to step on Mars. And I was like, yeah, you don't need to sweet talk me to me. I'm fine. There will be females there. And yeah, it might be a female, but why am you telling this to me? Well, I found out later in a few years' time, I'm not sure exactly, but astronauts actually told me that among them, they had decided that whomever was going to be sent to Mars, there will be females in that crew, because if NASA is paying, that means that's taxpayers' money of Americans, and the rules and regulations of taxpayer money is that there cannot be bias. So there will be females in that crew, American females, and perhaps also European females. That's my hope. And they, and the astronauts among themselves have said, the first step on the moon was a male astronaut. Now we're going to another heavenly body, to this planet, Mars. Then if we are getting there, then the first step will be a woman. So let's hope it to be true. Funny thing is, and I've showed you this picture before.
Things are being a bit frozen there. There you go.
Am I back again?
You're good now. Yeah.
Okay.
It was just momentarily.
Yeah. This is a poster for the program that the European Space Agency made in 2001, so many years ago, to show that, this is what we're going to do, and now we're going to get all the way and put humans on Mars. And like I said, in 2001 already, the European Space Agency officially portrayed a female astronaut on Mars and not a male. Now, I think I'm going to stop. I mean, I have a lot more things to tell about, other important ladies, because thankfully a lot of females are in charge, and the German Space Agency, DLR, is actually led by a female, Pascal Ehrenfreund, who is an astrobiologist, so a scientist, and not just a manager, which is interesting. Anyway, let's stop and let's have your questions.
All right, beautiful. If you'll stop your sharing screen options, and then we'll see everybody. Here's what we'll do, guys. We've got about 20 or so people on. I want to hear your thoughts or questions. Jesse, you had a great one about the difference between what a commercial astronaut is. Why don't we come to you first, since that's what I got in chat.
So is a commercial astronaut, when we're talking about commercial, do we mean that just the regular everyday citizens can fly to space, or are we talking like training with certain companies or anything like that?
Well, a commercial astronaut is an astronaut picked by a company and not by a government. So a commercial astronaut could be actually a commercial astronaut being sent to the International Space Station, if a company would be willing to pay for it. But for the rest, mostly a commercial astronaut at the moment, but this could change. And the moment means suborbital flights, just going, into space for a few minutes, 4 minutes, Mindy said, and then coming back again. But it's not, so that's the commercial parts, that commercial parties, which means companies, are paying for it instead of governments.
And could I ask you, Mindy, I'm going to unmute you. Let's see here. We have a girl online. Her name is Dharma, and her goal is to go become a fighter pilot, go to the Air Force Academy, and then pursue, let's see if I'm not having any luck unmuting you. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So would you talk to maybe, especially Dharma, and some of my other females on here may have those questions, but she's been dreaming of being an astronaut now for 8 years. She's 13 years old. So she's been dreaming of it since she was 5. You'll see her. Dharma, can you wave at everybody? That's Dharma. That's my future astronaut. Can you tell her a little bit about your process in becoming a commercial astronaut?
Yeah, sure. Anyway, I think it's a great idea that you like the idea of becoming a fighter pilot, because that can always help you. Like Artemis said, the fighter pilots, as one of the things on your resume, always weighs very heavily, traditionally. To be honest, I don't always understand why, but this has been the tradition of selecting the pilots from selecting astronauts from people who have been in the military before. So it's always a good thing. Now, how to go in to get there? I mean, it's funny because Artemis was mentioning standards of fighter pilots, and I also tried to become a fighter pilot, but I was told at the time I was an inch too short. I think they have changed things now. I don't understand. It's unbelievable. I'm 5'3", but I think I think they now have accepted 5'3". That's like 160 centimeters for people in Europe.
Yeah, the thing, of course, if you say that a person is supposed to be a certain height, you're actually also having a bias against a lot of non-white people. Because not everyone is as tall as people are in the Netherlands. Because, yeah, I'm very under tall. We agree on that. But most people here are 6 foot, something, 6'3", 6'7", quite normal. If I have a conversation, I have to look up. That's the way in the Netherlands it is. So, and Mindy knows, if you walk on the street and you see 20-year-old people, students or young employees in companies, then most of them are extremely tall. If they're not, then they probably are, from migrant stock recently, because even those migrants that came in 2 generations ago, and I don't care where you came from, they will have grown. And, there's this scientists are not quite sure why we grow. It's perhaps because we drink a lot of milk, even if we're adults. I don't know, but it's, we are tall.
The milk and the cheese. But anyway, I mean, so I didn't manage to get into the Air Force Academy because apparently people could not figure out how to design a chair for me to sit in that was tall, that was okay to accommodate my size. Now they have better ergonomics, and now somebody's like who's my size is allowed to get in. But anyway, I don't know how tall you are. How tall are you, Dharma?
Let me unmute you, baby. How tall are you, Dharma?
Still can't hear you.
Hey, Dharma, how tall are you, baby?
You're on mute.
Oh, yeah. Let's see.
No, she's not on mute.
Say it again. I'm going to read your lips. 5 foot. 5 foot? 2.
5 foot.
3.
5'3".
Okay.
Okay. At least your height is not going to work against you. No. So assuming you are getting decent grades in school and you do some team sports, which I think is helpful for getting into your extracurricular activities,
Yes.
both as an astronaut and as a fighter pilot. That's always looked well upon. So if you haven't started doing team sports yet, maybe pick one that you would like, and staying active, physically fit, and then of course getting good grades. All of those things are really helpful to getting into the Air Force Academy. And then if you can finish your degree and you want to become are you an American or are you a European? I didn't understand where you were from.
Because I'm not sure what, yeah, so she's in, Hagerstown, Maryland.
Okay, there you go. So, so if when you've gotten your degree and you're a fighter pilot, then you can apply to become a NASA astronaut. That's probably the best time to do it. After you have to have at least a bachelor's. I think now it's actually a master's. They've changed it to a master's this year. It used to be just a bachelor's, and now it's so you'll have to then go and get your master's in something, and maybe something scientific, so you can understand how to do some experiments when you get to the International Space Station. But as Artemis was saying, there are other ways to potentially get to space that like I'm going to be doing, because I tried those ways and unfortunately I didn't make it. But luckily there is a competition called the Career Astronauts competition. And people who have gotten a bachelor's, now you're still a little bit too young for that, but who knows, when you get your bachelor's, you can apply also for this competition. They're going to go through different types of challenges where people will learn how to work together, for example, underwater, to do similar tasks that astronauts will do, like repair a mock space station, and or going into caves and working together and doing sort of kind of cave exploration, similar to how the astronauts train. And the winners of the competition, 4 people will win 4 tickets to go on a Virgin Galactic, probably. We're not sure if it's Virgin Galactic or Blue Origin, but one of these suborbital space flights. So you can get a chance to, if you win the competition, it's absolutely free. You do not have to pay anything, and then you'll be trained to go into a suborbital flight. So you'll get parabolic flight training, which is where you'll feel like what that weightlessness was. That picture that Artemis showed earlier of me was taken in a parabolic flight. So you can actually pay for these flights. I think they're about $5,000 to take. It's about a 1-hour flight, and you get about 15 parabolas where you'll feel every single time you're on the top of the parabola, you'll be weightless for 22 seconds. And then you'll come crashing down to the ground. And then you'll be weightless again. And then you'll come crashing down to the ground. And there's pads all over the wall. So that's one way you can feel what it's like to be weightless here on Earth. And then the other 2 trainings that we're suggesting are good ideas, because as Artemis said before, if you don't train yourself, this suborbital flight, which is only 90 minutes long, is going to be over before you know it. So the second training would be going into a centrifuge and feeling what it's like to get launched. And everything. So when you're getting launched on Virgin Galactic or any of these suborbital vehicles, as well as let's say going to the ISS, you're going to have tremendous G-forces pulling blood out of your brain, pushing it down into your feet. And if you don't learn how to breathe properly and keep the blood in your head, you're going to pass out. You're just going to black out. And so that would not be fun, because you will miss your trip. And so you got to learn these breathing techniques. I'll just do it one really quick, because it's not going to be pretty the way it sounds. But if you put your hands, everybody have a chair, put their hands on a chair. If you can see my chair, I'm sitting here with, okay. You're going to put your hands on a chair, and you're going to take your feet like you're going to be pushing against a footrest. And I want everybody to just take their shoulders and kind of bear downwards. Kind of, when I say bear down, I mean like push down and hold your breath in and squeeze in. And I'll do this in a second. And then when you do that, you got to kind of push, almost, it sounds not very glamorous, like you're going to the bathroom. So you got to kind of tense your stomach muscles up and go, and then hold that for 4 seconds and then take another breath and then down. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then up. Take a breath. Again, one more time. Down. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. And every time you do that, you're forcing the blood into your brain. And then it's not pretty, but it's going to make you not pass out. And if everybody's doing this, you'll feel how hot your head.
Yes, yes,
My whole face is really warm right now because I just pushed all this blood in my brain. I'm almost sweating. And you got to do that like several times when you're launching, when you're on launch, or else that blood will go. So that's how you do that. Just keep kind of tensing and then bearing down and holding your breath and squeezing, and then take a deep breath in. And that's that's one of the breathing techniques. So that's what you're going to have to learn also. And the last training thing is a mental training, which is what my inner space training is all about, how to get people to relax and stay calm while all this stuff is going on around you. So all these 3 trainings are really important. I'm going to pass it back over to you, Artemis, and to Janet. But anyway, thank you for your question. And Dharma,
brilliant.
You make us proud, and I really hope you get there one way or another, either by commercial space or by being a NASA astronaut.
I think she's well on her way. Now, Tapaswini from India, you had a question, my dear?
Usually what happens is during flights or even space flights, sometimes we get scared when it's the first time, or even when we're used to something. Even then we get scared a lot of times. So how do you deal with such things?
Afraid.
So how do you deal with your fear? Maybe that's to Mindy or even to Artemis, of people that have gone into space. How do you deal with your fear?
Well, face it. I mean, the thing is, don't deny that you will be fearful. You're a human being, and these situations are, more dangerous than sitting on your chair looking at this screen, I presume. So, acknowledge that, and also think about it before you go, and also realize that, you might be afraid, but if you go into space or do anything else, but especially if you go into space, then there are so many people that have been working really hard to make sure that it's a success and that you survive and that everything goes well, that you actually are safer going into space, I think, than riding a bus. Because I do not believe that we have that many, tests and whatever for a normal bus ride. But we do have those if you go into space. So I do believe that, acknowledge the fact that you're afraid, because that's normal. And there's nothing wrong with being afraid. Just realize that, being courageous is not being without fear. It's having fear, but still doing what needs to be done. Still going through it. That's having courage, not, being unafraid, because that's actually very unnatural.
Mm-hmm. Great answer. Anything you want to add, Mindy, to that?
Well, sure. It's funny because one of the Dutch astronauts, who is the unknown Dutch astronaut, Leopold van den Berg, he's a guy who had to become American in order to fly with the Americans and do research. And he was at a conference that I happened to go to, and I asked him if he was ever fearful. And he said he was terrified. He said, and because we like to think that astronauts are Superman, Superwomen, and who don't get scared of anything. But he was quite honest, and he said that even though he practiced his parabolic flight stuff on Earth, and he knew what it felt like to go weightless, he says the first time, when he got up in orbit and he was going to take his seatbelt off to fly around, he says, I didn't dare do it. I felt I was paralyzed. I couldn't do anything. And someone actually in the cabin who he was flying with had to kind of like look at him and kind of coax him and say, come on, we'll do this together, and kind of took his hand. And even though he was, he had training, he was still really scared. And I thought this is fascinating, because usually if you ask NASA, about fear and everything, and you'll typically get the answer is, we train our astronauts so well that they can do things in their sleep. They're so trained, that typically they don't get any kind of fear. But Leopold mentioned this to me, and I think also what Artemis is saying is, everybody's human,
Yeah.
even if you have the training. I think the training really helps in order to minimize these kinds of like deer in the headlights, fight or flight kind of feeling that you're going to get, especially the first time. I think it's, like the first time I was in a centrifuge and I felt 6 Gs on my body, I was also like, wow, this is pretty heavy. And, the second time was less, the third time was better, the fourth time was better. And then I started to relax more. And, so most of these astronauts that will go to the ISS will have a lot of training, so that they can do things in their sleep, even, but chances are they're not going to be frozen like Leopold from the Berg was, but it still can happen. So you're going to need other techniques, like good breathing exercises, to try to kind of help yourself calm down. And that can also be practiced before that you fly. So, and then the last kind of thing is, maybe someone can help, someone more experienced can kind of coax you through it. But hopefully you don't have to be at that point, when you're actually in space, that you're still scared. But it's totally possible, that the anxiety can come even if you're trained, but chances are much, 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 much less. The training really, really helps a lot. So, but we're not perfect, And the first time we do something, it's always scary. And then after that, it gets easier and easier. That's why training is so important.
Great, you guys. Go ahead,
A bit
Artem.
about this Dutch astronaut that was afraid. The thing is, he wasn't really an astronaut. This was a scientist working for a company. He was a one of the world-renowned scientists in growing crystals. Now, his company wanted to know, if you grow crystals in, zero gravity, will they grow better or different, or, whatever happens? It's they wanted to do research, and they had asked NASA, can we bring someone up to the Skylab, because the International Space Station didn't exist yet in the 80s. And yeah, NASA said that's fine. If you want to do this very specific research, that it would take far too long for any astronaut to be trained in that, you simply have to select your own company person who is willing and able to do this in space. And that's up to you. And of course, we will also vet this person to see whether this person is really good enough to go into space. So, there was this group of people that were saying, yeah, I want to be selected. Yeah, I want to go for the company into space. And he had this boss of Lodewijk van den Berg had to bring a list of 10 people. And he got stuck. 9 people volunteered. He couldn't find the 10th person. And so he went to Lodewijk, who, like I said, who was world renowned in growing crystals. And that was exactly what they wanted to do in space. And he said, Lodewijk, do you mind if I, add your name to the list? And Lodewijk, who is actually a really short person, you should look up pictures. I will try to find some pictures of him and the other astronauts going up, because it's really kind of ridiculous. You have all these really tall people, normal tall people, and this really short, tiny person in between. And that was Lodewijk. And so what happened is that Lodewijk said, sure. And they both, his boss and Lodewijk said, yeah, I will never be selected, because, look at me. I don't look like an astronaut at all. No, they agreed on that. So, of course, the astronauts had to do certain tests. One of the tests was whether they really knew their stuff, this growing of crystals. Now, I told you he was one of the best in the world. So sure enough, Lodewijk got selected to the smaller group of the 10, okay, because, he was really good at what he was doing at the company. So then, they did some physical tests. And strangely enough, Lodewijk, this tiny little man who didn't want really to be an astronaut, he was just doing, he hadn't planned on it at all, in the end was selected because he actually did best on all the tests, also the physical tests. So he ended up going into space, And he had two passports, a Dutch and an American passport, because he had them both, as far as I know. And like Mindy said, he had to be an American to do this because, you know, he was going on into space with an American spaceship. So no foreigners just like that allowed. And so he went up and he did his thing. And there was very little public relations, you know, no big newspapers articles about him at all, because he went into space just a few months before the first government selected Dutch astronaut, Dutch government selected, European Space Agency selected Dutch astronaut Wubbo Ockels was supposed to fly. And Lodewijk van den Berg, I met him also in 2004 and several times afterward. He told me that he didn't want to steal the thunder of Wubbo Ockels because he didn't feel like he was a real astronaut. It just kind of happened to him. It was never planned. It wasn't like the other one. So he said, you know, it's fine. I don't need, you know, media all over me, you know, television interviews, etc. So he was kind of like a normal person going, almost like a space tourist, going into space. And so, sure, he was not as well trained as the other NASA astronauts. So he was probably more in tune with his fear and all the other things yet still. And so I immediately believed that he said, you know, he was, you know, simply fearful, simply being a human being. And remember, girls and boys, this man was the best in his field on the world in growing crystals, but he didn't need to be the best astronaut. He didn't feel that he needed to present himself as being more courageous or better or whatever. He just was secure and confident in what he could do very well. And so all the other things he took for, you know, he took in stride. He had to be an astronaut to grow these crystals. Fine. He go into space for 10 days and do the growing. And it actually was very successful. So that was it. That's another thing. It's okay to say, I'm good in this, but not good in something else. That's also a very adult, and actually I think also a very, you know, balanced astronaut type of thing to do. To say, yeah, I'm great in this, but I can't sing.
That's lovely.
One more thing about, we were talking a lot about short people, but I can tell, for anybody who's short, there's good news because you will be better equipped in a centrifuge. Because most people who are tall with long necks have a much harder time at surviving the G-forces and being okay with it. Shorter people have typically a much easier time in the centrifuge. So the things that you can do,
is that the reason why I always feel okay with 3G and all the other people around me go like, oh, horrible, I need to vomit. I go like, fine.
So there are advantages in being small in space.
Oh, okay.
Well, you guys have been so wonderful. I know some of you have to go on to your other classes. Mindy, thank you so much for joining us this morning. So guys, I want to announce a few of them are not with us today, but the winners of Miss Sydney's kind of like writing 250-word contest are Maggie. With your fantastic story, you will be receiving an autographed book. So it's like, she even sent me an autographed copy, so I feel very lucky. Ella, you also are going to receive a book. And let's see, Christopher is not on here today. And Micah, I named you also an honorary mention there. So you are going to get a book. So all of you guys be looking for those. I just, it's taking a while to get those things from Amazon at the moment, but as soon as I get them, I will mail those out to you. So thank you for doing your homework. If you haven't sent your body map, yesterday was kind of the deadline. So I'm going to send those on to Dr. Susan Ipjewell. Last week, we also had that moment where Dr. Ryan Kobrick was talking about designing your own spacesuit. He wants to take a look at those. And tomorrow, don't miss tomorrow, we'll have Dodd Galbraith back. He's going to be talking about Earth's mimicry. So kind of today through tomorrow around the globe, we're celebrating Earth Day. So there'll be a little bit of a challenge and a prize tomorrow. But if you're interested, you can tell your parents, hey, can we watch the documentary Mercury 13 on Netflix? Because that will tell you the story of these amazing ladies who truly should have been astronauts had the world been a little bit more accepting of the power of females and what they were able to accomplish. But I love and adore all of you. Thank you, Artemis, for another great presentation. You always bring something amazing. Mindy, thank you for joining. And again, let your mind revolve around this thought. The universe is always expanding. Let your mind do the same. We'll see you tomorrow, everybody. Bye.
Bye, bye, bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
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 Take care, guys. Mwah.